Here's a question for you. How do you extend a finite resource? Some cattle producers will tell you that they're not growing beef, they're growing grass. But that grass has limits. Eventually, it goes to seed. And in Alberta, it goes dormant because of the cold. During a drought, this finite resource is even more limited because you don't have the moisture to get the growth you'd expect, that growth your ranch is counting on. There are management practices that you can use to extend the growing season so you don't have to feed bales earlier or longer than makes financial sense for your ranch. I'm Derek Leahy, and in this episode of Rural Roots to Climate Solutions, we're talking stockpile grazing. Welcome back to the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast series, Getting Through Drought. The series looks at the best management practices cow-calf operators in Alberta can use to build up their ranch's resiliency against drought. The hope of the series is by creating better understanding on how to implement these BMPs and why these BMPs are effective against drought. Alberta's cow-calf producers will have a better shot of getting through the next drought, staying in business, and just generally living happy and healthy lives. For most of you listening to this right now, I don't really need to tell you how stressful a drought can be for a producer. In this episode, we're looking at stockpile grazing and all the different forms that can take. We'll be talking to Ben Stuart, who runs two farming operations, one in Saskatchewan and the other one in Hardisty, Alberta, about how they use stockpile grazing to extend the grazing season on their farms. Stockpile grazing may not be the first BMP that comes to mind when we're talking about drought. If the grass isn't growing, what the heck is there to stockpile, right? Admittedly, this BMP probably falls more in the category of what you can do in preparation for a drought as opposed to what you can do when you're in a drought. That being said, we all know how damn expensive hay and other types of feed can get in a dry year. So if you can find ways to stockpile what little forage you have during a drought, the blow to your pocketbook will be a little less severe. Here's Ben introducing himself and his farming operations. Oh, and you might notice the person asking Ben the questions doesn't sound anything like me. It's because it's not me. Cheyenne Younger of our Regenerative Agriculture Lab, a very cool project by the way, did the interview for this one. She did a great job, too.
Okay, so I'm Ben Stuart. We have two operations, one in Hardisty, Alberta, and one near Yorkton, Saskatchewan. Currently at the Saskatchewan farm right now, and we're running two very similar operations at both locations.
You want to tell us a little bit about how your operations look? Are they cow-calf? Are they grain? Are they mixed?
So we're mixed operations. Over the past number of years, we were more cattle dominated, and we're changing things now. We're sort of moving more towards grain or having grain, I guess, as a higher component of the mix. So what we're really trying to do is find that balance between grain and cattle, where we get the synergies of both. The cattle markets are certainly tough, being a cattle-only operation or a high ratio of cattle. It has been tough from a financial perspective, but the cattle we see as a really valuable tool. And so, we will always have cattle. We see the value that they have other than just the financial side of it from a year-to-year basis. They're a valuable tool in the whole soil health and regenerative farming aspect. And they do create benefits for the cropping system. So that's where we're really focusing on getting that synergy right between the number of cattle, the grain acres we have, and really getting the best out of both, making them work together.
And right here, Ben talks about some of the environmental factors he has to work with.
It's kind of interesting between the two farms. At Hardisty there, we're a lower, it's definitely a drier climate. We're in that sort of that 8 to 10 is kind of a good year. We've had higher, 14, 15, but, we probably average around that 8 to 10 inches of precipitation in the growing season. And then our ranch in Saskatchewan, we would be typically in that 15 to 20. So definitely a higher precipitation out there. And that was definitely one of the reasons for looking that far afield is to be in a higher precipitation area for what we're doing. It's just kind of a nice situation to get a little more moisture. And saying that was 4 years ago that we set up the ranch out here, and we went through 3 of the driest years on record when we started out here. So and Hardisty actually was getting a lot more moisture. So it was it was flipped upside down a little bit. So we were scrambling there for a bit to try and just make things work and kind of get ahead. So we were sort of hand to mouth for the first 3 years, and then finally this last year, 2022, we got some good moisture out east, and that was certainly welcome after 3 years of dry.
And what types of soils are you working at in both of your locations, Ben?
We're sort of more in the black soil zone here in Saskatchewan, and then Hardisty, where it kind of varies, but we're in that brown, more of that brown soil zone. We've got there's more sandy type soils in Alberta, a little bit more rolling hills and varied elevation across the land. So yeah, it's definitely quite mixed. One thing we really notice at Hardisty there compared to out east, when you get the moisture there, which doesn't always come, but when you get it, it does hold on within those soils well. You notice that you've had rain a few weeks later, whereas we're probably a bit more free draining out here. So we get more rain, but you need more rain more often as well. And so when you don't get it here, you certainly notice it. Notice it a lot more.
Up next, Ben goes over the different management practices that, in his view, fall into stockpile grazing.
Yeah, so stockpile foraging, I guess, it's pretty broad. It covers a few different things for me. I guess stockpiling anything is certainly beneficial, and it's a big part of our system. So originally, just a bit of my background. Originally, I'm from New Zealand, and I moved here in 2008, and so my background was in forage-based systems, grazing systems, year-round grazing. So when I came to Canada, I mean, the biggest thing that we were looking at was just extending that grazing season to go from between 90 to 120 days was kind of the average. Well, it was only basically a third of the year. So I definitely wanted to see if there were some opportunities to extend that and potentially take that year round. But initially it was just about extending that growing season. So it's really important then to, you need to have stockpiled forage and feed to get through the winter because we only grow feed for a certain amount of time. So it was a matter of looking at what different systems there were. Extending the grazing season was the first obvious one. So implementing rotational grazing, managing those pastures so we could carry good quality feed into the early part of the winter and through the winter, and then if we got too much snow, we would carry that feed. Would be then a valuable resource to have in the springtime. So the grazing one was the first one the first obvious one for me, not having dealt with Canadian winters before. And then it was a matter of, okay, what can we need a feed reserve and a feed source to cover us for the winter time. What tools do we have? And swath grazing was one that we really took on. And that was a new one to me, but not a new one to Canada. But we took that on, and that was, we started implementing different species in that mix and things that we thought would work, and basically broadening our mix from an oat barley mix to various other species. And that was, I was pretty impressed with how that system worked, because there's not many places in the world that you can grow something in the summertime, windrow it, swath it under the snow, and have it kept in basically the same condition it was at the time it was cut for 6 months. So that was pretty unique. You certainly couldn't do that in New Zealand. It would be rotted in a few weeks with the moisture and humidity, and everything's still growing underneath it too. So that's a real advantage. And the fact that when we're grazing that, the negative impacts of high density grazing that you can have in other environments like New Zealand, where you're pugging the soil, and in wetter climates, we don't have those impacts. So the ground's frozen solid. The utilization of that crop is really good. So that was really interesting to me to see that, and we really utilized that as a big part of our system, especially at Hardisty there. I mean, it works really well. We don't get, I wouldn't say excessive snowfall, that we can't get to those swaths. We really evolved that system over the last 10 years from an oat barley kind of standard mixture that a lot of other people were using at the time to looking at what other species we could use, from forage brassicas to turnips to different legumes and clovers and things. So and that's worked really well. There's hay and there's silage. So, I mean, bale grazing was another one to extend that system and, stockpiling that feed. And I think bale grazing works really good. It's great for the land. You can import those nutrients to areas that maybe need to be reclaimed or looked after, and soils that need to be built up and brought back to life. That's another one that we wouldn't be able to use in various other warmer climates or wetter climates anyway, quite as well, because of the utilization of that feed. And then silage being another one. One system that we use, majority of the time now for feeding out our silage is through self-feeding silage pits. So we'll make a silage pit out in a field somewhere where we want that manure to be redeposited, and we feed off the face of that pit just with an electric wire, and the cows just graze over and above that wire, and we just push that in on a daily basis, and that saves our fuel and labor expenses and time. And then we can use that in conjunction with some of the swath grazing and bale grazing. The nice thing about having silage and what that's allowed us to do is we can carry it over from year to year, and it's been really good insurance for us. And knowing that we've got that in our back pocket as that insurance has actually allowed us to expand onto some of these other extended grazing things, the swath grazing. We've really been able to sort of take a leap forward with that, knowing that we've got the silage sort of in our back pocket as insurance. And so then we feel a lot more comfortable putting in more acres of swath grazing and more acres, doing more bale grazing and extended grazing, knowing that we've got that in our back pocket. So that was probably one of the important things to get set up and moving forward into the extended grazing was having that insurance that we could take the risk out of swath grazing. A lot of people would say, "Oh, we can't swath graze in our area because we get too much snow." And what are you going to do when you get too much snow and you can't swath graze? It's like, well, we're gonna feed silage because we've got that in our back pocket, or we've got some extra bales. And then it just allowed us to expand those acres and get more comfortable with that system. So I think we always want to make sure we've got that in our back pocket. We got caught out a little bit last year with the drought, especially in Saskatchewan, where we were going just from year to year and we weren't able to build up that feed inventory. We didn't have a lot of feed going into the winter, and we didn't have as much silage put up. We did have some swath grazing set up. We got a little caught out there. We were able to utilize that swath grazing, but in hindsight, we probably should have stockpiled that feed in a different way, just because of the way the winter went. We had extra snow and it was cold and all that. So hindsight's great. So, I mean, when I look back and knowing that we didn't have quite the feed reserve, we would have probably silaged that or baled that. And so that was a good learning experience. But we still utilized that feed. It wasn't wasted. We still kept the animals out there. We just supplemented them a little bit extra. And then in the early part of spring, we were grazing it at that time. So we were just able to basically defer that grazing to a different part of the year. So for us, it's never been a complete waste. And then that's what I try and tell people too, when they kind of worry about almost over worry about things a little bit too much, I think. And you just got to know that you just sort of take a step back and look at the system, and it's never been a waste, because we all know the snow disappears, and then the feed is available under there, and we utilize it at that time. So it's the same with our extended grazing on our grass. When we first started grazing, it was like, man, this is the year it's growing. We need to utilize everything, otherwise it's wasted. And so, we would graze things down looking at this, and we're thinking, man, we'd leave some cover. It's better for the pastures and the alfalfas and the clovers to go into winter with some root reserves and being able to photosynthesize as long as they can. And we utilize that feed in the spring and clean it off before the new growth comes. And that's been it's been a big game changer for the longevity of our pastures, and it fits with the health of our animals. We can get them out there earlier. We calve in May, June, so they're calving on either some carryover grass from the year before. There's a few different systems have worked out well, and then the other one is the cover crops, growing something in the spring to graze in the autumn time. And that's also really helped our pastures, because we've been able to pull these cattle off pasture earlier in the year. Not all of them, but a significant number. Pull them off, destock them, those pasture areas, start grazing those cover crops. And we can grow a lot more feed per acre on some of these annual cover crops that we can, and we can keep the feed quality at that later part of the season when the feed quality starts to diminish on our pastures, and we can let those pastures rejuvenate a bit before the winter, build up some reserves, and then and our cattle are being fed better because they're going on to these cover crops, which are high nutrition, and we stretch that out into the winter. So for us, it's just been about juggling things around and kind of reshaping that puzzle as to where we can grow feed, what type of feed we can grow at any point of the year, and just aligning that up with the seasons and with the demands of the animals.
At this point in the interview, Ben talks about drought tolerance with monocultures versus mixed crops.
You're not going to grow anything if it doesn't rain. It doesn't matter what you put in, you're not going to have a great crop. And so, we've had instances where we've grown something and, it hasn't grown well, and it's like, well, you can't write that off because it didn't rain. Or I've had other people that have tried some of the brassicas, for instance, so, oh, that doesn't grow in our area. And it's like, well, maybe it doesn't. I'm not saying it doesn't, but then, how did your oats go in that year? It was horrible, and we grew 20 bushels of oats, and it's like, well, okay, so it's maybe not just the species, it's the fact that you didn't have any rain that it didn't work. So that's where we've found the diversity has worked worked so much better, and that's the same with our pasture blends. We have a high legume base in our pasture. We have grow a lot of alfalfa. We graze a lot of alfalfa. It's part of a blend. Some of those years that alfalfa is really dominant. It's about that drought mitigation and that soil health, and growing the highest quality feed that we can with the seasons that we've got. There's very few places in New Zealand that can grow good alfalfa, and so I wasn't used to grazing and growing alfalfa when I came here, but then, you see it growing in the ditches and on the railway tracks and things like that. And it's like, man, this is a pretty good species. So, we've got to figure out the best way to graze it and include it in our blends, because, it grows twice as much as your brome grasses and things, and the feed value is twice as good, and the animals perform twice as good on it under the right grazing conditions. When it comes to drought, I guess I always come back to that diversity of species that can handle those dry conditions, and that was really one that worked really well in the drier climate and in the Hardisty area there. And the free draining soils, that's where alfalfa really grows well, and those roots can get down deep. And that's the other thing too when we're talking about diversity. It's not just the diversity of the plants themselves above ground. It's the diversity of those root systems below ground that you don't actually see. You've got some shallow rooted plants. I mean, your grass species are going to be quite shallow rooted, and then you've got your legumes and or tap-rooted plants, for instance, they're going to go down a lot deeper. They're going to utilize that soil profile better. They're going to bring up nutrients and minerals, and they're going to help with that water cycle. There's a lot to all this. We've been doing it for I guess a while. It feels like a while, but there's just so much more that we need to that we can learn and figure out. So that's what keeps it interesting, I guess.
Here, Ben gets into when to start stockpiling your forage and how to use rotational grazing to build up that stockpile.
I mean, the best time to start working on your drought strategy is probably right now. The best time to work on your drought strategy is not in the middle of a drought. You want to, because then you're just forced to react to whatever circumstances there are. You're either buying high-priced feed because in a drought, feed is going to go through the roof. I mean, that's a given. It's just it's supply and demand. You're then either going to be forced to sell cattle in a lower market. There's not many higher markets in a drought case situation when everyone's in the same boat. It's a little different when it's just regional pockets of drought, but when it's widespread like 2021. Then you're all in the same boat. That's the time that you want to have a good feed reserve, and you want to be buying cattle when the market's low and have that feed to get them through. You're always going to make a lot better decisions when you've got feed on hand, and that's not just through your own cattle. It's from a marketing standpoint, not just a straight up feeding the animals that you've got standpoint too. Coming up with a plan, no better time to start than now. And there's no better time to start than when you're not in a drought. So when you've got excess feed, start putting some, start stockpiling some, start putting some away or pushing it forward into the next season. You don't need to be 2 or 3 years ahead necessarily. Or, you want to be a couple, I guess. And it's not like you need to have a whole year's worth of feed. It kind of comes down to economics as well. It's not always, you're not always able to carry 1 or 2 years of feed as a buffer because you've got to turn that into dollars at some point as well. And since it's going to be a little different, another thing that we have to manage through drought is we carry a certain number of what we call trading cattle. So that'd be yearlings that are going to grass, some older cattle that we can easily sell and we can easily shift. Whereas, if we were all cow-calf, are a little harder to move, to gather, to round up, to, even just to market. And there's probably less people that are interested in buying extra cow-calf in a drought, whereas there's probably more options for moving yearlings and older cattle that are, easy to gather up, easy to get on trucks, easy to ship out. They can go south to the States. They can go to various feedlots. There's more options. So we definitely have a component of trading stock that can be upped and moved easily to help mitigate that if we get into that situation. And then stockpiling that feed, we'll keep that excess silage. We'll keep some extra straw. We'll keep some, we try anyway. And a prime example of being behind the 8 ball was when we moved out to Saskatchewan and we were hand to mouth for 3 years. We thought we'd built up enough, and then we'd mow it all down, and come springtime we didn't have any left. And we basically did that for 3 years just because we didn't have great growing seasons to grow the crops that we anticipated to build up that feed reserve. And then finally this year we've been able to do that. So yeah, it was always our plan, and it is always our plan to carry that feed, have call it 6 months worth of feed to carry through, at least for our cow calf, to keep our capital stock, our cows in the system, because we can sell some of our trading cattle at kind of any time if it gets tight. So if the year that you start happens to be in that drought situation, I mean, it's still the best time to start if that's when it is. It's obviously going to be a lot harder to build up feed reserves in a drought situation. That's where managing and utilizing that feed that you've got really comes into play. You've got a limited resource. You want to make sure that you're managing it well to stretch it out. And that's again where the rotational grazing comes in. We're effectively manipulating those plants to grow more. Through rotational grazing, we can actually grow more grass by keeping it in a vegetative state and rotational grazing. And that's one thing that is, it's sometimes a little hard to get your head around. a lot of people sort of think, well, we're going to grow an X amount of grass, whether we continuously graze it, whether we rotationally graze it, we're going to grow the same amount. And that's not true. We will actually grow more pounds of dry matter when we rotationally graze and manage that grass than we would ever do if we were set stocking. From the outside in, if you don't understand that and you look at some of our fields and some of our fences, and we're out there continuously moving cattle from field to field and setting up fences, if you don't understand it, I guess it doesn't make any sense. Why are they moving their cattle when they could just not move them and have them out there? Well, there's a reason we do it, and that reason is to keep that quality and to grow more feed. If you do one cut of hay and you let your hay grow throughout the year and cut it closer to the autumn time, you're only going to get that one cut and your growth is going to be limited. But if you cut your hay at the right time, you're going to grow probably 2 to 3 times as many bales on that land if you get your timing of cuts right. And that's just one example. It's no different with grazing. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to manipulate that grass to keep growing and grow more.
Since this podcast series is a direct result of the drought and extreme heat of 2021, we asked Ben if there was anything from that growing season he wanted to share with us.
I definitely like to look at things as a learning experience, and the biggest negative was probably our conception rates were definitely down. That was understandable. We spent a lot of the time getting water sorted out. We had dugouts that were going dry. We were having to set up water systems and things like that. We're in areas that we never thought we would have to do that. There was this management. I guess the positives of a higher conception rate were the fact that we got rid of a bunch of cows that were the ones that couldn't conceive in that system. And I'd like to think our herd going forward is going to be a whole lot more resilient, and we've weeded out those ones that just couldn't handle it. So I mean, that's definitely going forward the long term. I mean, that's I see that as a pretty big positive. There wasn't any real negatives, but there was definitely some. It was more challenging. There was more to do, more to monitor, more to see, more things to try and figure out, and the feed situation, and there was definitely a bit more stress, but on what are we going to do? But it wasn't, we couldn't control it, so we managed what we could control. We definitely moved and rotated cattle more often than we would have, and that actually we did get moisture at the later part, and because of our rotational grazing again, we were able to utilize that moisture, and we kept those plants in good healthy growing standpoint. So when it did rain at the end, even though it was for a short period of time, we grew a lot of really good quality feed in the autumn time that we were able to utilize at that later part of the year. Some of the things that we've found in these drought situations too is our cattle, like our gains on our younger and our yearling cattle, we're actually able to obtain some pretty good gains because we keep that pasture and it doesn't get away, it doesn't get rank, it doesn't go to seed on us. So the nutritional content of those pastures are actually typically higher in a drier year when you can't manage them, as opposed to years when we just grow a lot of lush feed and we can't keep that quality in that feed. Gains are typically higher. That the cattle are in a drier, I guess, environment, which is actually better than a continuously wet environment. So yeah, and again, we can move those cattle and ship them at the appropriate time without just mowing our grasses. In that year, we offloaded some of those yearlings, and we made an early decision to offload some of them. Basically half of them we got rid of, and it was about July time. And then sort of that August, September, we actually got some rain, and by being able to destock early and with enough to stretch the rest of the cattle out, and then, basically wait for that rain to come. And then it did come, and we had great pastures at the end of the year to finish those yearlings on and capitalize on some of those good gains. I guess we weren't forced into making sort of rash decisions because we did have a bit of a plan, and we were able to move some cattle and destock a little earlier.
So one of the cool things about a podcast is that people can be listening to them months or years from now? Let's say there's a prairie producer listening to this podcast a few years from now. What would you say, any words of advice or any encouragement? You know, if they're finding themselves in a drought, do you have any encouragement or advice that you could share with them?
Make a decision. The worst thing you do is make no decision when you're in a drought situation. And by being able to make a decision, you need to have a plan. And sometimes that can be a little tough when you've got, you know, you're stressed out from various other things, and you've just got to take off. You got to unload some of that stress, I guess, and feed situation being a big one. So making a decision early is definitely better than being forced to make a decision, you know, when you've got no other choice. And then, you know, really look at your system and utilize that as a learning opportunity and get the most out of it. Because if you're going to stay in the business, it's going to be cyclical. So that, you know, we're going to be in these situations again. If you don't make a change, don't expect a different result next time it comes. You've got to make a change, and the first loss is often the best. Take the first loss initially to kind of regroup and restructure, and instead of trying to drag things out and think that you're gonna be able to claw your way out of it, and then all of a sudden that hole just gets deeper, and that becomes a lot harder to get out of. Understanding what you can grow and what you can manage on your farm is pretty important. And, you know, as the season progresses, we get later into the season, our pasture growth rates and our forage growth rates are going to start declining. We know that winter is going to come. Things are going to stop growing. We know that. So, you know, we can actually budget on how much feed we think we're going to grow, how much, you know, to make some of those decisions a little bit earlier. You know, winter seems to always come at a surprise, you know, and it still does for me from time to time. You kind of get caught up and things are doing good, and then bang, here it is. It's like, we're a little bit behind where we thought we would. But, you know, at the end of the day, we shouldn't really be surprised by it. When we have good autumns, make the most of those opportunities to extend that grazing. And one thing that we've done is grazing stubble, and we've got a lot of neighbours and things on board too, where we're grazing their stubble later in the season, and that's actually worked out really good for extended grazing. Typically, on the average, is basically 20 acres of slough and edge and things that don't get farmed that grow feed that can be utilised. So when we have a good autumn, we're able to extend that grazing. I mean, you know, we do, and especially when it's stubble grazing, because that's kind of a given there. It's not one that is just going to, you know, that's certainly not one that you can really utilize in spring when guys are seeding their crops. But when you don't have a lot of snow, you have an open autumn, you can capture those days. I mean, they're kind of given, and you can save your $3 a day hay, and, you know, hopefully work out an arrangement with a neighbour or on your own crops that it's not costing you the same. And that has worked really well. I mean, we've grazed stubble into January. There's been times we've been tempted to kick them back out there later on too, after we brought them close to home and started feeding, and just to capitalise on some of those extra days. And that's what it takes is those small gains that you can get that really add up. You get an extra 20, 30 days grazing. I mean, that's huge, and it might not sound like a lot, but that's a big number in our grazing system, and that's where, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, swath grazing doesn't work. We get too much snow. We have too many issues, and it's like, you don't have to swath graze all winter. You can swath graze. You can put a month of swath grazing in to extend your grazing or cover crops and leave them standing, and extend your grazing into November, December time. That's a pretty big win. You know, there's not a lot of margin in the cattle business. 30 days of extra grazing might be your margin right there. Talking like $100 a head, which is pretty low. I mean, that's 30 days at $3 a day hay. Then there's your $100 right there. So yeah, maybe if you're already doing 100, well, you push that to 200. I mean, you've just doubled your income from your cows right there. That goes straight to the bottom line. So there's lots of little things, and that's how we started, was trying little things and seeing if they worked. It started with just extending the grazing season, keeping the cattle that we had at the time out of the feedlots for as long as we could, extend that season. Basically, September, October, November time is the best time to put weight on cattle. The water's not frozen, as long as we've got good quality feed in front of them. The days are cooling off, the days are getting a little shorter, you don't have the heat stress. everything kind of lines up. So if we can have stockpiled feed for that time of year, that's when we actually need it. And that's when we'll get the gains on animals, whether they be yearlings that are about to go into a feedlot, or whether they be, just our cow-calf operation, feeding those calves, those cows milking properly at that time of the year, getting weight on animals. Typically, September, October, November, that's when the grass is done. That's when cattle end up heading into feedlots typically. And that's why the feedlots get the good gains at that time of year as well. And back on the ranch, we're missing that opportunity if we don't have the feed in. When we're only grazing for typically, 90 to 100 days, there's a period of transition when those cattle go out that they've got to get adjusted to the grass, and their rumens have got to adjust. And then if we don't manage that grass well, the grass goes rank and they don't put on the pounds. And then we look at the system and we say, well, grass doesn't work for putting weight on cattle. It's more expensive. We don't get the gains. We don't get that. But it's not actually the grass's fault. It's the system that needs to be looked at. We can grow better quality feed. You look at the alfalfa in the high 20s for protein and high energy levels and stuff. We can grow the feed. A lot of that feed is harvested and then re-fed to them. You can't actually increase the quality of feed by harvesting it and then re-feeding it. So the best time to get that quality is actually when it's growing in the ground, and that's when the management of that comes in, and that's the challenge of it. And I guess that's what that's kind of what I enjoy. That's a bit of a moving target. If it was anything different and straightforward, it'd be pretty boring, and I probably wouldn't want to do it. I'm not sort of into that repetitive system, and that's probably why I'm not working in a feedlot too. It's just a different system.
We hope you enjoyed our 10th installment of the Getting Through Drought series. We've got 2 more episodes left for this series, and we hope to have them out there soon. If you want to learn more about grazing management, we recommend downloading and listening to episodes 24 and 40. Honestly, most of the episodes we've done for this series are also a useful resource on grazing management, since this series is all for you, the cow-calf producer in Alberta. Rural Roots to Climate Solutions is an Alberta-based initiative empowering agriculture producers and the communities they live in with climate solutions. Rural Roots runs workshops, farm field days, webinars, and the Regenerative Agriculture Lab, produces a farmer's blog, works with rural communities to develop their own renewable energy projects, and of course, we do this podcast. For more information about us and what we do, go to the website, which is www.rr2cs.ca. The rest of the amazing and talented Rural Roots to Climate Solutions team is Marie Galanka, Cheyenne Younger, and Kristen Mountain. The podcast is funded by a variety of Alberta-based funders, and the Getting Through Drought series is largely funded by Results-Driven Agriculture Research, or RDAR. This episode was done in partnership with Young Agrarians. My parts of this episode were recorded in Calgary. So that means they were recorded on Treaty 7 lands and in the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Happy farming wherever you are in Alberta. And remember, what's good for the climate is good for the farm.